May I ask you a simple question? When you leave your stuff at your workplace, at home, and then you come back to the office, your workplace, at home, and you see somebody moved your stuff, somebody used your stuff, how do you feel? Personally, I feel infuriated because why somebody will touch my stuff? Do you agree with me? Well, imagine the same thing you're doing to somebody as a part of the torture. But you don't torturing the body. You don't touching the human being. Instead of this, you're torturing their mind. That method is called Zersetzung, which translates to decomposition or disintegration. Is a covert and methodical form of psychological warfare used by the East German Ministry for State Security, also known as the Stasi during the Cold War. The nefarious practice included a variety of measures aimed at destroying the lives, reputations, and mental well-being of individuals perceived to be enemies of the state, or perhaps prospective dangers to East Germany socialist rule. What that means, it's a surveillance, harassing, gaslighting, propagating false rumors, and different sorts of psychological manipulation were all used in Zersetzung. This dark period in history serves as a vivid reminder of the effectiveness of psychological methods in suppressing opposition and keeping control inside authoritarian governments.
In 1989, communist regime was moved away, the Berlin Wall came down, and 1 year later, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, and the East was unified with the Federal Republic of Germany in the West to found today's Germany. Among many other things, Germany inherited the archives of the East German secret police, known as the Stasi. Only 2 years after its dissolution, its documents were open to the public, and historians as me started to study these documents to learn more about how the GDR surveillance state functioned. Perhaps you have watched the movie The Lives of Others. This movie made the Stasi known worldwide. And as we live in an age where words as surveillance or wiretapping are on the front pages of newspapers, I would like to speak about how the Stasi really worked. At the beginning, let's have a short look at the history of the Stasi, because it's really important for understanding its self-conception. Its origins are located in Russia. In 1917, the Russian communists founded the Emergency Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, shortly Cheka. It was led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. The Cheka was an instrument of the communists to establish their regime by terrorizing the population and executing their enemies. It evolved later to the well-known KGB. The Cheka was the idol of the Stasi officers. They called themselves Chekists, and even the emblem was very similar, as you can see here. In fact, the secret police of Russia was the creator and instructor of the Stasi. When the Red Army occupied East Germany in 1945, it immediately expanded there. And soon it started to train the German communists to build up their own secret police. By the way, in this hall where we are now, the ruling party of the GDR was founded in 1946. 5 years later, the Stasi was established, and step by step the dirty job of oppression was handed over to it. For instance, the central jail for political prisoners, which was established by the Russians, was taken over by the Stasi and used till the end of the communism. You see it here. At the beginning, every important step still took place under the attendance of the Russians. But the Germans are known to be very effective. So the Stasi grew very quickly. And already in 1953, it had more employees than the Gestapo had, secret police of Nazi Germany. The number doubled in each decade. In 1989, more than 90,000 employees worked for the Stasi. This meant that one employee was responsible for 180 inhabitants, which was really unique in the world. At the top of this tremendous apparatus, there was one man, Erich Mielke. He ruled the Ministry of State Security for more than 30 years. He was a scrupulous functionary. In his past, he killed 2 policemen, not far away from here, who in fact personalized the Stasi. But what was so exceptional about the Stasi? Foremost, it was its enormous power, because it united different functions in one organization. First of all, the Stasi was an intelligence service. It used all the imaginable instruments for getting information secretly, such as informers or tapping phones, as you can see it on the picture here. And it was not only active in East Germany, but all over the world. Secondly, the Stasi was a secret police. It could stop people on the street and arrest them in its own prisons. Thirdly, the Stasi worked as a kind of public prosecutor. It had the right to open preliminary investigations and to interrogate people officially. Last but not least, the Stasi had its own armed forces. More than 11,000 soldiers were serving in its so-called Guards Regiment, which was founded to crash down protests and uprisings. Due to this concentration of power, the Stasi was called a state in the state. But let's look more in more details at the tools of the Stasi. Please keep in mind that at that time the web and smartphones were not yet invented. Of course, the Stasi used all kinds of technical instruments to survey people. The telephones were wiretapped, including the phone of the German Chancellor in the West, and often also the apartments. Every day, 90,000 letters were being opened by these machines. The Stasi also shadowed 10,000s of people, using specially trained agents and secret cameras to document every step one took. On this picture, you can see me as a young man just in front of this building, where we are now photographed by a Stasi agent. The Stasi even collected the smell of people. It stored samples of it in closed jars, which were found after the peaceful revolution. For all these tasks, highly specialized departments were responsible. The one which was tapping phone calls was completely separated from the one which controlled the letters. For good reasons. Because if one agent had quitted the Stasi, his knowledge was very small, contrast to Edward Snowden, for example. But the vertical specialization was also important to prevent all kind of empathy with the object of observation. The agent who shadowed me didn't know who I was or why I was so right. In fact, I smuggled forbidden books from West to East Germany. But what was even more typical for the Stasi was the use of human intelligence, people who reported secretly to the Stasi. For the Minister of State Security, these so-called unofficial employees were the most important tools. From 1975 on, nearly 200,000 people collaborated constantly with the Stasi, more than 1% of the population. And in a way, the minister was right, because technical instruments can only register what people are doing. But agents and spies can also report what people are planning to do and what they are thinking. Therefore, the Stasi recruited so many informants. The system of how to get them and how to educate them, as it was called, was very sophisticated. The Stasi had its own university, not far away from here, where the methods were explored and taught to the officers. This guideline gave a detailed description of every step you have to take if you want to convince human beings to betray their fellow citizens. Sometimes it's said that informants were pressured to becoming one. But that's mostly not true, because a forced informant is a bad informant. Only someone who wants to give you the information you need is an effective whistleblower. The main reasons why people cooperated with the Stasi were political conviction and material benefits. The officers also tried to create a personal bond between themselves and the informant. And, to be honest, the example of the Stasi shows that it's not so difficult to win someone to betray in order to betray others. Even some of the top dissidents in East Germany collaborated with the Stasi, as for instance Ibrahim Böhme. In 1989 he was a leader of the peaceful revolution and he nearly became the first really elected prime minister of the GDR until it came out that he was an informant. The net of spies was really broad. In nearly every institution, even in the churches or in West Germany, there were many of them. I remember telling a leading Stasi officer, if you had sent an informant to me, I would surely have recognized him. His answer was, we didn't send anyone, we took those who were around you. And in fact, two of my best friends reported about me to the Stasi. Not only in my case, informers were very close. For example, Vera Lengsfeld, another leading dissident, in her case it was her husband who spied on her. The famous writer was betrayed by his brother. This reminds of the novel 1984 by George Orwell, where the only apparently trustable person was an informer. But why the Stasi collected all this information in its archives? The main purpose was to control the society. In nearly every speech, the Stasi minister gave the order to find out who is who, what meant who thinks what. He didn't want to wait until somebody tried to act against the regime. He wanted to know in advance what people were thinking and planning. The East Germans knew, of course, that they were surrounded by informers. In a totalitarian regime that creates mistrust and a state of widespread fear, the most important tools to oppress people in any dictatorship. That's why not many East Germans tried to fight against the communist regime. If yes, the Stasi often used a method which was really diabolic. It was called Zersetzung, and it's described in another guideline. The word is difficult to translate because it means originally biodegradation. But actually it's a quite accurate description. The goal was to destroy secretly the self-confidence of people. For example, by damaging their reputation, by organizing failures in their work, and by destroying their personal relationships. Considering this, East Germany was a very modern dictatorship. The Stasi didn't try to arrest every dissident. It preferred to paralyze them. And it could do so because it had access to so much personal information and to so many institutions. Detaining someone was used only as last resort. For this, the Stasi owned 17 remand prisons, one in every district. Here, the Stasi also developed quite modern methods of detention. Normally, the interrogation officer didn't torture the prisoner. Instead, he used a sophisticated system of psychological pressure in which strict isolation was central. Nearly no prisoner resisted without giving a testimony. If you have the occasion, do visit the former Stasi prison in Berlin and attend a guided tour with the former political prisoner who will explain you how this worked. One more question needs to be answered. If the Stasi was so well organized, why did the communist regime collapse? First, in 1989, the leadership in East Germany was uncertain what to do against the growing protest of people. It was especially confused because in the mother country of socialism, the Soviet Union, a more liberal policy took place. In addition, the regime was dependent on the loans from the West. Therefore, no order to crash down the uprising was given to the Stasi. Secondly, in the communist ideology, there's no place for criticism. Instead, the leadership stuck to the belief that socialism is a perfect system, and the Stasi had to conform that, of course. The consequence was that despite all the information, the regime couldn't analyze its real problems, and therefore it couldn't solve them. In the end, the Stasi died because of the structures that it was charged with protecting. The ending of the Stasi has something tragic, because these officers were kept busy during the peaceful revolution with only one thing: to destroy the documents they had produced during decades. Fortunately, they had been stopped by human rights activists. That's why today we can use the files to get a better understanding of how a surveillance state functions.
After the end of World War II, Germany was left in a state of political and economic devastation. A country that had only a few years earlier been at the center of a global conflict was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Allies: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This division not only altered the geopolitical map of Europe, but also determined the fate of millions of people for decades to come. In the East, under Soviet influence, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, was established, a state that sought to build a socialist society while keeping its citizens under strict surveillance. From its earliest days, the GDR created mechanisms to monitor even the smallest details of its citizens' lives. The most powerful and feared instrument of this control was the Ministry for State Security, known as Stasi. This was not merely an intelligence agency or police force. The Stasi was a complex network penetrating every sphere of life, from workplaces to family gatherings. Its mission was not only to identify the enemies of the state, but also to maintain an atmosphere of fear, where every word or gesture could be used against a person. The creation of the Stasi occurred amid political uncertainty. Soviet advisors played a key role in shaping its strategy and methods. Officially founded in 1950, the ministry became an integral part of the Socialist Unity Party apparatus. Its operations encompassed both internal security and foreign intelligence. The primary goal was to ensure total loyalty among the population and to suppress any signs of opposition. What distinguished the Stasi was not just intimidation, but a systematic collection of information. Its agent network included hundreds of thousands of unofficial collaborators, often unaware of the full extent of their participation. They could monitor neighbors, colleagues, friends, and even family members. Letters, phone calls, meetings in cafes, all of these could become sources of intelligence for the Stasi. The system was so thorough that even high-ranking officials lived in fear of potential denunciations. Documentary testimonies from former GDR citizens repeatedly highlight the same themes: mistrust, fear, and a sense of isolation. People feared expressing their true thoughts even in private family circles. Many recalled that the most terrifying aspect was not physical control, but psychological. The feeling of constant surveillance where every step could be analyzed and used against them. The Stasi archives, which were opened after the fall of the Berlin Wall, revealed the staggering scale of surveillance. Millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of agents, thousands of cases of persecution, all of this proved that the GDR authorities viewed society as an object for total monitoring. While many people, during the existence of the Stasi, were unaware of the extent of surveillance, today we can reconstruct the chronology and methods of one of the most fearsome intelligence agencies of the 20th century. This documentary material will reveal how the Stasi operated, the methods it employed, how ordinary citizens became informers against their neighbors and even relatives, and the price society paid for life under constant observation. We will delve into archives, real testimonies, and event reconstructions to understand what it meant to live in a state where every action was monitored and every gesture could be evidence of anti-government behavior.
The Stasi was more than just a secret police force. It was a meticulously organized machine designed to monitor, control, and manipulate every facet of life in the German Democratic Republic. Its structure was hierarchical and far-reaching, reflecting the priorities of the Socialist Unity Party and its need to maintain absolute control. At the top sat the ministers and senior officers, directing a network of departments that specialized in internal security, intelligence, psychological operations, economic oversight, and the management of informants. Each department had specific responsibilities. The Department of Internal Security focused on detecting political dissent, monitoring citizens who might oppose the government, and preventing subversive activities. The Foreign Intelligence Department was responsible for gathering information abroad, tracking defectors, and infiltrating organizations outside the GDR. The Psychological Operations Department employed advanced techniques to manipulate public perception and break down the resolve of individuals deemed a threat. Lastly, the Informant Network Division coordinated thousands of unofficial collaborators across the country, forming the backbone of the Stasi's surveillance system. What set the Stasi apart from other intelligence agencies was the scale and depth of its operations. It was estimated that the Stasi maintained a network of hundreds of thousands of unofficial collaborators, individuals who reported on the private lives of their neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. Some were coerced into cooperation through blackmail or threats. Others volunteered, motivated by ideological loyalty, personal gain, or the promise of career advancement. These informants, often referred to as unofficial collaborators, played a crucial role in ensuring that the Stasi could maintain near total awareness of the population.
The operational methods of the Stasi were as systematic as they were pervasive. Informants submitted detailed reports about the people around them, documenting conversations, behaviors, and personal opinions. Ordinary citizens might be unaware that someone close to them was secretly recording their activities. A neighbor's casual remark about government inefficiency, a private critique shared among friends, or even a minor complaint at work could all become valuable intelligence. The sheer scale of information collection created a climate in which no one felt truly safe or private. Training for Stasi officers was rigorous and exhaustive. New recruits underwent intensive instruction in surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, and the psychological manipulation of individuals. Officers were taught to anticipate human behavior, detect inconsistencies in statements, and exploit personal vulnerabilities. Their work was not limited to overt operations. Much of it relied on subtle observation, the ability to blend into everyday life, and the careful cultivation of informants. The Stasi's geographic reach extended to every corner of the GDR. Regional offices were established in cities and towns, staffed by officers and informants who could report on local developments in real time. Rural areas were not neglected. Even villages had representatives to ensure the party's control reached the smallest communities. In effect, the Stasi had eyes and ears everywhere, from the bustling streets of East Berlin to the quiet country roads, leaving no space free from scrutiny. Archival documents reveal the level of precision involved in managing such a vast network. Files contained personal information, social connections, employment records, political opinions, and even intimate details of citizens' lives. Reports were meticulously cataloged and stored in massive filing systems, enabling the Stasi to track individuals over years, sometimes decades. These records allowed them not only to monitor people's actions, but also to predict potential threats to the regime, plan interventions, and manipulate social dynamics. The Stasi's organizational structure was not just about control, it was also about creating a sense of inevitability. By embedding themselves in nearly every institution, workplace, and community, they made it clear that resistance was futile. Ordinary citizens knew, even if only vaguely, that any act of dissent could be discovered, documented, and punished. This psychological pressure was a deliberate tool, reinforcing the perception that the state's reach was limitless and that the Stasi's presence was omnipresent. Despite the fear and oppression, the Stasi's operations were not always perfect. Mistakes, misinterpretations, and internal rivalries sometimes led to flawed reports and misguided actions. Yet the overarching system remained terrifyingly effective, instilling obedience and conformity throughout society. Those who lived under its watchful eye learned to adapt, to speak carefully, and to guard their thoughts and words. In essence, the Stasi was more than a secret police force. It was a sophisticated apparatus designed to infiltrate every aspect of life. Its hierarchical structure, widespread informant network, and meticulous record-keeping allowed it to maintain an unprecedented level of surveillance and control. To understand life in the GDR, one must grasp the mechanisms of the Stasi, a force that transformed ordinary citizens into instruments of observation and turned trust into a weapon.
Life in the German Democratic Republic was defined by an omnipresent sense of observation and control. For ordinary citizens, the Stasi was not an abstract institution operating behind closed doors. It was a constant reality, infiltrating homes, workplaces, schools, and social gatherings. Every interaction, every casual remark, and even private thoughts carried potential consequences. The pervasive surveillance created a society in which fear and mistrust became second nature, and where privacy was a concept largely forgotten. The methods employed by the Stasi were both sophisticated and invasive. Apartments were bugged with hidden microphones, telephone lines were tapped, and letters were intercepted and read. Informants were everywhere: neighbors, colleagues, teachers, and sometimes even family members. A casual comment about the inefficiency of a workplace, a whispered opinion about the government, or an expression of personal frustration could all be reported and documented. The pervasive surveillance created a society in which fear and mistrust became second nature, and where privacy was a concept largely forgotten. The methods employed by the Stasi were both sophisticated and invasive. Apartments were bugged with hidden microphones, telephone lines were tapped, and letters were intercepted and read. Informants were everywhere: neighbors, colleagues, teachers, and sometimes even family members. A casual comment about the ineffectiveness of a workplace, a whispered opinion about the government, or an expression of personal frustration could all be reported and documented. The most mundane events often became evidence for the authorities to monitor, manipulate, or punish individuals. Psychological pressure was a central tool of control. Citizens often lived in fear of denunciation. Families learned to speak cautiously. Friends withheld true opinions, and colleagues avoided controversial conversations. Trust became a fragile commodity. The Stasi's ability to turn ordinary people into informants meant that no one was entirely safe from surveillance. Even in seemingly private settings, conversations were filtered, gestures were calculated, and smiles could hide anxiety or suspicion.
Many personal accounts reveal the deeply intrusive nature of Stasi operations. One teacher was summoned for questioning after a student reported a comment he made about governmental policies during a classroom discussion. A young woman came under surveillance because her brother had fled to the West, and her home was repeatedly searched for incriminating material. The psychological toll was immense. Constant fear, anxiety, and uncertainty shaped daily life. People learned to internalize their thoughts and monitor their own behavior, anticipating scrutiny where none was obvious. The Stasi also used techniques of subtle manipulation. Operations often involved provocateurs, individuals embedded in communities to encourage dissenting behavior so that targets could be caught and discredited. These covert tactics created confusion and eroded social cohesion. Friends were unsure of each other's loyalties, and neighbors became cautious, often avoiding interaction entirely. This strategy turned social networks into mechanisms of control, allowing the state to monitor and influence behavior without overt force. Surveillance was not limited to high-profile targets. Ordinary citizens, especially those considered politically unreliable or connected to dissidents, were constantly monitored. Reports included detailed notes on behavior, associations, and even hobbies. The Stasi meticulously recorded these details in their extensive archives. Files documented life events ranging from professional decisions to personal relationships, enabling a comprehensive profile of each individual. This level of documentation ensured that no one could act without the risk of exposure, fostering an environment in which compliance was more a matter of survival than loyalty.
Despite the oppressive environment, people adapted. They developed subtle forms of resistance, finding ways to preserve personal integrity and small freedoms. Codes of silence emerged among trusted circles. Clandestine communication methods were devised, and some individuals risked their safety to challenge the regime. These acts, though often small, represented a refusal to be entirely subsumed by the machinery of surveillance. The Stasi's psychological operations extended into every aspect of life. Educational institutions promoted ideological conformity. Workplaces enforced political loyalty, and community events served as opportunities for observation. Even cultural expressions, such as art, theater, or literature, were scrutinized for signs of dissent. The state's reach was comprehensive, ensuring that citizens internalized the principles of control and self-censorship. Archival evidence, including detailed files, personal letters, and testimonies, paints a vivid picture of life under this pervasive surveillance. Citizens were not only monitored, they were conditioned to participate in their own observation. Informants recorded intimate details of neighbors' lives, and families lived under the silent threat that private actions could be weaponized. The cumulative effect of this system was profound. It shaped not only behavior, but thought itself, creating a society in which caution, conformity, and fear were woven into the fabric of daily life. In sum, life under the Stasi was a constant negotiation between survival and authenticity. Citizens were compelled to navigate a landscape where every word and action could have serious consequences. Psychological pressure, the omnipresent threat of denunciation, and the clever use of informants ensured that the machinery of the Stasi extended far beyond offices and surveillance rooms into the very homes and minds of the population. Understanding this reality is essential to comprehending the lived experience of the GDR, a society where the act of existing itself was constantly scrutinized.
The Stasi's methods were multifaceted, highly organized, and designed to maintain absolute control over the population of the German Democratic Republic. While psychological pressure was a core element, it was paired with a wide array of operational techniques that ranged from sophisticated surveillance to targeted manipulations of individuals and communities. Their goal was not simply to collect information, but to anticipate, influence, and neutralize any threat to the regime. One of the primary tools of the Stasi was telephone interception and mail surveillance. Telephones were tapped extensively, often without the knowledge of the individuals involved. Letters sent through the postal system were opened, read, and sometimes resealed before reaching their intended recipients. These measures ensured that even the most private communications could be monitored, providing officers with insight into political opinions, personal relationships, and potential dissent. Informants, trained in observation, documented everyday conversations and routine behaviors, often producing detailed reports that were stored in extensive archives. In addition to passive surveillance, the Stasi conducted apartment searches and clandestine listening operations. Hidden microphones, cameras, and other recording devices were installed in homes to capture private interactions. The precision of these operations was striking. Officers and informants were instructed to maintain secrecy, avoiding any action that might alert targets to their presence. Over time, these methods created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Citizens never knew whether their private spaces were truly private, and the line between personal safety and exposure became increasingly blurred. A central tactic employed by the Stasi was the use of provocateurs and agents provocateurs. These individuals were strategically placed within communities, workplaces, and social circles to elicit incriminating behavior from citizens. By encouraging seemingly innocuous acts of dissent, they created situations in which individuals could be legally or socially discredited. These operations were often subtle, leaving victims unaware that their actions had been manipulated for state purposes. The result was a climate of uncertainty and suspicion, further isolating citizens and undermining trust between friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Interrogations and arrests were also crucial components of the Stasi's operational toolkit. While physical intimidation was sometimes used, psychological pressure was more common and often more effective. Officers were trained to exploit personal vulnerabilities, analyze behavior, and apply techniques designed to break down resistance without leaving overt physical evidence. Many victims described intense stress, anxiety, and fear during these encounters, as the Stasi meticulously documented their responses, using them to reinforce patterns of control or to pressure further compliance. Economic and social manipulation represented another layer of the Stasi strategy. Employment opportunities, educational access, and professional advancement could all be influenced through covert intervention. Citizens found themselves subject to subtle obstacles, a promotion denied, a job transfer, or even social exclusion, all orchestrated to reinforce loyalty to the state and discourage dissent. In this way, the Stasi extended its influence far beyond immediate surveillance, shaping both personal and professional lives. Archival records reveal the meticulous nature of these operations. Each file often contained hundreds of pages detailing an individual's actions, associations, correspondence, and even personal habits. This allowed the Stasi not only to track behavior, but to predict and preempt potential threats. The organization's ability to combine data from multiple sources, cross-referencing reports from different informants and surveillance operations, created an unparalleled intelligence apparatus, capable of controlling society on an unprecedented scale.
Another, perhaps also quite infamous method that the Stasi employed were the so-called Romeos, or the Romeo spies. So the idea was that they would train, and this is what the psychology department was for to some extent, they would train East German men to go over to West Germany and enter into romantic and sexual relationships with secretaries or typists of kind of important political and industrial and military organizations, and then obtain objects that way. And again, this could range from kind of just going in there and having a date with somebody and then trying to get information that way, all the way up to fake marriages that were set up this way. So there were people who genuinely moved over there, married a secretary who worked somewhere, and then stayed for years married to them, with kind of the intention of getting documents back. The Stasi referred to this, so they had some interesting language that they used for this. So this was intimate coverage, which I thought was quite interesting. The more common, and excuse my French, the more common term was fucking for the fatherland, which even the Stasi used within. I did say this talk was X-rated, didn't I? Just as a sort of content warning. Bit late now, I guess. But yes, so this was basically one of the things that they used on quite a large scale. So this isn't just something for sort of spy novels, but actually happened on a relatively large scale. The idea was that West Germany was still a relatively conservative society, and most women that worked as secretaries and typists did so only whilst they were single. And then once they married and had children, they'd basically become housewives. And so they knew that there was a large kind of group of women that are potentially receptive to this type of spying. Another important aspect of the HVA was its collaboration with the KGB. I've used the example of Putin here because he worked as a KGB agent in Germany and in Dresden from 1985 onwards until the end, until 1990. And this is his Stasi ID. So this doesn't make him a member of the Stasi. This just goes to show how closely the two work together. So almost all of the KGB agents in Germany had direct access to the Stasi's like files and facilities. So this would have enabled Putin, say, for instance, in Dresden, to go and eat his lunch in the Stasi canteen, but also to use like their facilities and their resources. This worked really well, particularly for the KGB, because it allowed them to focus most of their energy on the US. So whilst the Stasi also had some agents over there, by and large, they didn't really manage to get a foothold on the US in the way that they did in Western Europe. And vice versa, basically, the KGB, there'd been a huge crackdown in Britain, I know, for example, in the, I think, late 1970s, where a lot of the KGB people were expelled from the country and actually identified. And so the KGB basically withdrew more or less from Western Europe. And the Stasi moved in there with the HVA, and so it's kind of like a resource sharing activity, if you will. The KGB also set its headquarters in Germany up where it could easily reach the Stasi. So they had their own headquarters in Karlshorst, just outside of Berlin, and the GRU, so the military intelligence service, also set itself up in Potsdam, which is also just outside of Berlin. So the idea was that they could get in there quickly and share resources, or like in Putin's case here with the kind of local branches. So he was in Dresden, for example. It would again kind of work in tandem for where the local branches of the Stasi were as well. So that's worth pointing out, that they worked very, very closely together in tandem. And then the last method that was employed was to try and get Western citizens themselves to spy on behalf of the HVA. So they would basically get people, try and recruit people in, say, West Germany or Britain or France or elsewhere, to try and get them to pass information over to the Stasi. And this was also a long-term thing. So if you think back to what I said about Guillaume, the same applied to these things. So this wasn't necessarily directly aimed at getting information here and now, but also kind of building almost like spy rings, basically, going forward. So this could sometimes be just done based on ideology. So there were enough kind of communist and socialist sympathizers in the Western countries for them to recruit, particularly in university circles, and particularly in German departments, I might add, in Britain in particular. But it was also sometimes done with bribery, so there's a lot of money going back and forth. It could be done, especially in West Germany, with threats and intimidation. If people had relatives in the East, that could sort of be used as a means to blackmail people. And in that manner, basically, they managed to get quite a lot of people to work for them. So in West Germany, it's estimated it was sort of over 3,000 West Germans in 1989. Over the course of the Cold War, they reckon about 12,000 West Germans kind of worked one way or another with the Stasi and sort of got information over to it. In Britain, MI5 suspected just over 100 British people spying for for the HVA. That's going to be quite interesting because the files with these people's names, the so-called Rosenholz files, were handed over to Britain in 1993. And at the time, there was a huge debate, including in Parliament, around whether they should be published or not, and they decided to classify them. So at the moment, these files are still classified, and it's yet unknown who worked for the Stasi. And if you sort of do the maths in your head, that's about 30 years ago now. There are people who were recruited as students who are now lecturers, journalists, politicians, who would have at the time been sympathetic to working with the Stasi, but who've had their names sort of protected for the last 30 years. And next year, the 30 years of this 1993 date are over, and these files are likely to be declassified. So that would be an interesting one to watch. A lot of the work in Britain went through the East German embassy, which was opened in 1973. That's on the screen there. This is where the German embassy is still today. So this is 34 Belgraves Square in London, which is still operated by the German embassy today, as I think for functions and things, as an additional room to use in addition to their own embassy, which is also at Belgrave Square. But this allowed East Germans to basically come to London, say they work for the embassy, and then have a legitimate reason to move around London and around the country. And it turned into a bit of a sort of spy nest for the HVA in Britain.
We're going to tackle a pretty unsettling question today. Is it possible that a specific, notorious kind of psychological warfare, one perfected by the East German secret police, is actually still being used? We're talking about tactics that aren't just designed to shut people up, but to make them question their own sanity. And this quote, this gets right to the heart of it. The goal was never open oppression. It was a covert war on the mind, a kind of phantom menace that leaves its victims feeling totally alone, confused, and convinced that the problem isn't the state, it's them. So, to really understand what might be happening now, we have to look back. Let's start with where these tactics came from. The infamous East German secret police, the Stasi. They weren't just known for breaking bones, they were known as the soul breakers.
The Stasi had a very specific, very German word for this, Zersetzung. Now, that literally translates to decomposition. And that's exactly what it was meant to do, to make a person's social and psychological life basically rot from the inside out, to just decompose until they were no longer a threat to anyone.
You know, what is so sinister about these methods is how minor they can seem on their own. We're not talking about a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Imagine coming home and your chair has been moved just a couple of inches, or your favorite brand of tea is replaced by one you hate, or they send your spouse an anonymous compromising photo. These are little things, but when they happen over and over again, they create this creeping, crawling paranoia. They're designed to make you feel like you are losing your grip.
So here's the crucial part. The Stasi figured out that it was often way more effective to just paralyze a dissident than to actually imprison them. I mean, why create a martyr when you can secretly destroy their reputation, their job, their marriage, and their sanity? Zersetzung was all about making a person their own prison.
Okay, so now we're going to jump from the Cold War straight into the digital age. And this is where the story gets really, really weird. Which, of course, brings us to our big question. Was Zersetzung just some dusty relic of a defunct communist regime, or did the playbook survive? Just look at this table. This right here shows you the mystery we are diving into. On the left, you've got the Stasi's Zersetzung tactics, all documented in their own files. On the right, you have the experiences reported by a modern group of people who call themselves targeted individuals. The parallels are they're uncanny. Clandestine home entry, slander campaigns, electronic surveillance, psychological harassment. It is almost a perfect one-to-one match. So yeah, these are the targeted individuals, or TIs. Thousands of them have formed these online communities to share what they're going through, something they call gangstalking. They believe they're being systematically harassed by organized groups of people, and their descriptions of this harassment, well, they sound eerily familiar. So what is actually going on here? Well, there are two radically different ways to look at this. The first one views this whole thing through the lens of mental health. This quote from a self-described TI gives you a sense of the kinds of things being reported. They often involve claims that go way beyond just normal harassment, talking about things like electronic rape and voice-to-skull technology, where people believe sounds and even thoughts are being beamed directly into their head.
To many people, this sounds like a classic symptom of a persecutory delusion. And this is where the internet plays such a massive role. These online forums can become incredibly powerful echo chambers. Now, they definitely offer support for people who feel isolated and terrified, but they can also reinforce what might be delusional beliefs, validating even the most extreme claims and making it much harder for people to consider any other explanation for what they're experiencing. And the stakes here are tragically high. Since 2013, that number you see, 4, that's the minimum number of mass shootings or violent acts in the U.S. that were committed by people who identified as targeted individuals. The most well-known was the 2013 Navy Yard shooting that left 12 people dead. It's a brutal reminder that these beliefs, whatever their origin, can have devastating real-world consequences. But it's not quite that simple, is it? What we're looking at here is a declassified document about psychological operations, or PSYOP. It's a reminder that the idea of targeting the human mind is a very real military and intelligence strategy, and that just blurs the line, making it so difficult to know where a personal delusion might end and a targeted campaign could begin.
Which brings us to the second major explanation. This one argues that we can't just dismiss these claims so easily because they exist in the shadow of a very real and very documented surveillance state. Honestly, to believe that organized, state-sponsored harassment could be possible, you don't need a tinfoil hat. You just need a history book. The U.S. government has a long, proven record of using psychological tactics and illegal surveillance against its own people.
This timeline shows a really clear pattern. From COINTELPRO back in the 50s, which actively tried to neutralize groups like the Black Panthers, to the Church Committee's bombshell revelations in the 70s, to the massive expansion of surveillance after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, and then, of course, Edward Snowden's leaks confirming that the government was collecting data on a scale nobody thought was possible. The capability and the intent, it's all part of the historical record.
And this isn't just history. Modern programs like the Threat Liaison Officer or TLO network create a framework for this stuff. Intelligence fusion centers go out and recruit private citizens, hospital staff, clergy, just regular people to report on suspicious activity. This creates what one critic called a cadre of anonymous, citizen informants who are completely unaccountable to the public. It's a citizen spy network.
So, when you take that documented history of psychological operations, which are designed to exploit our weak points, and you pair it with the modern reality of these unaccountable citizen informant networks and mass digital surveillance, well, the claims of targeted individuals start to sound less like a delusion and more like a plausible, if extreme, extension of a known reality. So, where does all of this leave us? We're basically caught between two powerful competing narratives, and the actual truth seems to get lost somewhere in the middle of it all. This is the dilemma. On one hand, we could be looking at a serious mental health crisis, where the internet is just pouring gasoline on persecutory delusions with tragic results. But on the other hand, we have a state with a documented history of doing exactly these kinds of things, and now they have all the modern tech to pull it off on a massive scale. The government has essentially created a plausible scenario for its own worst accusations.
Ultimately, the state's own actions have created an environment where it's incredibly difficult to tell the difference between paranoia and perception. When you know for a fact your government has lied, has spied, and has actively tried to psychologically neutralize its own citizens, how can you ever be sure it isn't happening now?
People just would not believe the suffering that people in this community endure every single day.
I've lost just about all my friends. They're afraid to talk to me. They think it's very effective. They think I'm crazy.
My family doesn't know anything about it. I don't say a word to them. I don't know if my son knows, and I don't want anything to happen to him.
Really, the most important thing that we can do for victims is to connect them with others who understand what they're experiencing, because no one else will. And isolation is really a key weapon that these perpetrators use to bring a person down to the ground, basically.
If you go to see a psychiatrist, let's say it's the first time you're meeting a psychiatrist, and you say, I'm under police surveillance, and the psychiatrist will write you off as suffering paranoid schizophrenia, and then he will give you medication. So we must assume that this is what American society believes, that all these government agencies, which normally watch over people, don't actually watch people at all. If anybody think that they are being watched by this government agency, then they must be crazy. It cannot possibly be true.
There really is no help at the moment officially to assist target individuals. They can't go to the police, they can't go to the FBI, they can't go to Congress. There is nowhere that they can go. We are having to create the issue and also the solution.
Why isn't our nation listening? This could be them.
Zersetzung, no-touch torture, invented in East Germany by the Bolsheviks. That's what I'm experiencing. I've been experiencing it for the past 16 years, ever since I reported IHC, International Humanities Center, child trafficking. I was the broker on the account. I caught a very suspicious payment. I think it was a container coming from Asia. But yeah, so ever since then, friends backstabbing you, police parked down the street spying on you, taking your kid away from you to try and provoke you, anything they can do, therapists making up fake stuff. So it's called Zersetzung, and it hasn't gone away. It's the secret societies, and everybody and your brother is part of it. It has not gone away, okay? It's no-touch torture. It's completely horrible. You can call it gangstalking or community harassment or whatever you want to call it. But it's alive and well in America, and it's alive and well in our courtrooms. They don't follow the Constitution. They follow discretion. So they do whatever they want. They don't follow the law. So they take my kid away with no excuses and make up the excuses afterwards. And then the whole town pretends like I'm a bad guy. Because why? Because in 2009, I reported child trafficking. There was front page LA Times, and the authorities still have not done anything, even though I've reported it to everybody. So what do? They torture a dad, they ruin a child's life, and then they badmouth you all over town with the smear campaign.
And the target is followed around 24/7 by various communities that they are in. The community notifications will go out to various places: apartment rentals, future employers, stores, and communities where the target visits will all be notified. Masonic lodges, temples, churches, doctors' offices, fire departments, police stations, etc. A covert investigation might also be opened, an electronic means used by the civilian spies and snitches as part of the overt and covert monitoring and surveillance process. Individuals can be flagged, designating them as having a history of aggressive or inappropriate behavior. This notification system will follow the target if they move, change jobs, or visit other areas. It lets the community believe that the target is a person who needs to be watched or monitored. The identity of the person and the nature of the risk must be given to staff likely to come into contact with this person. While workers have the right to know the risks, it is important to remember that this information cannot be indiscriminately distributed. Individuals are being flagged without their knowledge. In many countries, these community notifications might fall under community safety and health laws. It seems that employers, educational facilities, and community centers are in some cases flagging innocent individuals as a means of revenge or controlling members of society. Maria Buffa, a former salaried employee in the personnel department at Ford World headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan, said she too was sent to a psychiatrist after she filed a sexual harassment complaint in February 1999 against a female coworker. "You think maybe I am the problem. Why else would they be sending me to a psychiatrist?" she said. The psychiatrist Ford selected, Dr. Edward Dorsey of the Midwest Health Center, made a report that said the only psychiatric symptom Buffa displayed was anxiety. Dorsey's report said that the referral came from Ford's medical department and was at least in part due to her complaints of the sexual harassment. He also noted that the Ford doctor who referred Buffa cited a couple of incidents. She was seen yelling at someone, and she had shown up at a fitness center, quote, wearing less than the usual amount of clothing for that physical activity. In April 1999, Buffa's boss fired her for the good of the company, she recalled being told. The process begins when the individual is then placed under overt and covert forms of surveillance. Everywhere the targeted individual goes, their name is flagged. In a big city, this could mean that thousands upon thousands of people are getting a notification about the target. The person is followed around 24/7. Foot patrols and vehicle patrols are used to follow the individual around as part of the monitoring process. During these patrols, a one-handed sign language is used to assist the citizen informants with communicating to each other. They will use this to silently communicate to any business the target enters or other areas. Gangstalking is experienced by the targeted individual as a psychological attack that is capable of immobilizing and destroying them over time. The covert methods used to harass, persecute, and falsely defame the targets often leave no evidence to incriminate the civilian spies. It's similar to workplace mobbing, but takes place outside in the community. It's called gangstalking because groups of organized community members stalk and monitor the targets 24/7. Many targeted individuals are flagged, harassed, and placed under surveillance in this way for months or even years before they realize that they are being targeted by an organized protocol of harassment. What happens during the monitoring and surveillance is very similar to what happened to many innocent individuals in the former East Germany or activists and dissidents in Russia. Many innocent people in the former East Germany would be targeted by the state, and then their friends, family, and the community at large would be used to monitor, prosecute, and harass them. The same persecutions and harassments are now happening in democratic countries. Once a person is flagged or has a warning marker placed on their file, the community becomes hypervigilant, and within this structure there is a targeted and illegal protocol of harassment that happens.
Statements that spanned more than 30 pages, the agency said it stands behind its program, part of a larger initiative it calls intelligence-led policing, which is hilarious because nobody has ever so much as inferred that the police are intelligent. It said other local departments use similar techniques and accused the Times of cherry-picking examples and painting basic law enforcement functions as harassment. I don't know. Going to somebody's house who hasn't committed a crime, who's not in the process of committing a crime, and harassing them at their parents' place of work, their gym, their friends' houses, and their own house 21 times in a little over a year does not sound like a basic law enforcement function. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It's okay, I'm not wrong. The sheriff's office said its program was designed to reduce bias in policing by using objective data, and it provided statistics showing a decline in burglaries, larcenies, and auto thefts since the program began in 2011. Wow, you read that sentence, you'd think, wow, James is full of shit and he's poo-pooing this thing, and he shouldn't be because obviously it works. Quote, this reduction in property crime is a direct positive impact on the lives of citizens of Pasco County, and for all that, we will not apologize, one of the statements said. Our first and primary mission is to serve and protect our community, and the intelligence-led policing philosophy assists us in achieving that mission. But Pasco's drop in property crimes was similar to the decline in the 7 largest nearby police jurisdictions. Over the same time period, violent crime increased only in Pasco. Here's where I take a moment and I let you all know that in Florida, because there is no state income tax, they inordinately set up speed traps and roadblocks in Florida to hit people with max fine crimes to help pad funding in cities and counties that don't get any grants from the state, which are generated through state income tax because they don't have one. So Florida is known for its over-policing to create revenue as it is. This is just putting that on steroids. Criminal justice experts say they were stunned by the agency's practices. They compared the tactics to child abuse, mafia harassment, and surveillance that could be expected under an authoritarian regime. Quote, morally repugnant is what it is. One of the worst manifestations of the intersection of junk science and bad policing, an absolute absence of common sense and humanity that I have seen in my career, said David Kennedy, a renowned criminologist at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, whose research on crime prevention is referenced in Pasco's policies. For years, the program's inner workings have remained largely out of public view, even as NOCO has touted its merits during debates and community forums. Reporters combed through thousands of pages of documents, watched hours of body camera footage, and spent months obtaining and analyzing the target list, which had not been previously released. Pasco is an overwhelmingly white county, and the program did not appear to disproportionately target people based on race. But juvenile offenders, regardless of race, were an outsized priority for the intelligence program, according to former deputies. Of the 20 addresses visited most by its dedicated enforcement teams, more than half were home to middle or high schoolers who were identified as their targets. NOCO took over the Pasco Sheriff's Office in 2011, appointed by Rick Scott. At the time, he was 35 and newly promoted, and he had joined the sheriff's office only 2 years earlier, had deep ties to Republican politics, but far less experience in law enforcement than the outgoing sheriff. He quickly rolled out a plan to remake the department that sounded like a pitch for the Hollywood blockbuster Moneyball meets Minority Report. The intent was to reduce property crime. The agency, which has 650 officers and covers roughly 500,000 people, would use data to predict where future crimes were likely to take place and who was likely to commit them. Then deputies would find these people and, quote, take them out. Pasco Sheriff's Office won a $95,000 federal grant, not a lot of money, to upgrade its computer system and hire a small team of civilian analysts. At first, they focused on identifying geographic crime trends and gathering information from people in jail. But NOCO wanted to make proactive strategies and intelligence gathering his agency's central philosophy. All employees were required to take a 2-hour course on intelligence-led policing. He referenced the program often as he ran for election for the first time in 2012 after he was appointed. Some residents appreciated it so much, he boasted in one campaign appearance, they threw deputies a block party. Oh, thank you, government! Thank you for creating a predictive algorithm that will pick anybody out of a crowd and create police harassment. We love you so much.
Surveillance state.
How can a regular person be talked into committing heinous acts upon another? And could you be convinced to potentially injure or kill someone else? I'm not talking about self-defense or during war on the battlefield, but someone you have never met before and have had no interaction with previously. How can perfectly normal people commit genocide? Like what we saw in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, or even in Cambodia in the 1970s, amongst other events. What causes people to be active participants in crimes against humanity? If we take Germany in the 1930s as an example, what caused a large part of a modern country to be willing in crimes against people that have been their neighbours and community members for years? It is a really fascinating thought experiment, as when you think to yourself, I could never do something like this, or even this. But what would it actually take for you to pull a trigger, push a button, or pull a lever? Well, this is where a psychologist set out to see what would be the minimum amount of suggestion for a regular person to administer a potentially deadly electric shock to someone they have never met before. The simple but effective study would be known by the inventor's name, the Milgram experiment. The actual experiment would not result in any physical pain, but extreme stress and inflicted insight to the participants. And this would create controversy with the study. As such, I'm going to rate it here 5 on my ethics scale. This is mainly due to it being a fascinating dive into our hardwired ability to obey an authority figure, even to the point of murder. Welcome to the dark side of science. Stanley Milgram was an American social psychologist born on the 15th of August 1933 in the Bronx, New York. His parents were Jewish and had fled Romania and Hungary during the First World War. His background and family ties to Europe would have an important effect on his later studies into social psychology, as word came back to the Milgram family during the late 30s and 40s of the atrocities inflicted by the Nazi regime. Although in relative safety in the USA, many of Stanley's family members were directly affected by the Holocaust. After the war, some surviving members of the family came to stay whilst finding a new life in the US. A young Stanley was exposed to the horrors experienced by his relatives, and this would stay with him, igniting an interest into the darker side of human nature. In 1954, Milgram received his bachelor's degree in political science from Queens College in New York. Initial applications to Harvard for a psychology master's were rejected, but was eventually admitted. The initial setbacks were due to Milgram not taking any undergraduate courses in psychology at Queens College. In 1961, Milgram received a PhD in social psychology. He became an assistant professor at Yale around the same time. Later on, he served as an assistant professor in the Department of Social Relations at Harvard from 1963 to 1966, And this brings us very quickly onto his obedience study, more commonly known as the Milgram experiment. Stanley's experience of relatives going through the Holocaust, coupled with the arrest and trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, sparked an interest into finding out what could make seemingly average people take part in atrocities. Eichmann organised the logistics of the deportation of Jews during the Holocaust. He made deportation plans down to the last detail. Working with other German agencies, he also determined how the property of deported Jews would be seized. What was interesting about the trial was that he claimed he had not dictated policy, but only carried it out, and that he was merely a cog in the machinery of destruction. Essentially, the "I was only following orders" defence. This highlights the question, that is following an order enough to convince someone to do something so heinous? Milgram would later say in 1974, when explaining the experiment, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? The experiment was pretty simple and would make use of three people: the experimenter, who was in charge of the session, the teacher, a volunteer for a single session, and a learner. Both the teacher and learner would arrive for the session together, and they would draw straws as to who would take each role. Participants were sourced via a newspaper ad saying, "We will pay you for 1 hour of your time in a study of memory." The teacher and learner, after finding out their roles, were taken into a room where the learner was strapped into what appeared to be an electric chair, and electrode paste was applied to the learner's wrist to prevent blistering and burns. The teacher would hear this being explained and see this happen. The experimenter, who was dressed in a lab coat in order to appear to have more authority, told the participants that restraints was to ensure that the learner would not escape. The teacher was allowed to experience a sample electric shock similar to what the learner would feel. Before beginning the experiment, the volunteers were informed that they would be paid regardless of the outcome, thus removing any financial incentive to any results. The teacher was led into another room where they could not see the learner but could hear them, and the experiment would begin. The teacher was then given a list of word pairs that he was to teach the learner. The teacher would then read the first word of each pair and read 4 possible answers. The learner would press a button to show his answer. If incorrect, the teacher was meant to administer a shock to the learner. If correct, the teacher would read the next pair of words. Each subsequent incorrect answer would mean the teacher had to increase the voltage in 15-volt increments. They were also instructed to announce the voltage before shocking the learner. Pretty cruel, you might think, but there was only one actual volunteer in each test, the teacher, who, unbeknownst to them, was the real test subject. You see, the learner was actually a stooge and wasn't receiving an electrical shock, and the chance drawing of straws to find out who would do either role was actually fixed, meaning the teacher would always be the teacher. Also, probably not surprising, the experimenter was also in on it. This meant that the whole experience of the teacher was controlled from the authority of the experimenter to the reaction of the learner. To ramp things up in later versions of the study, the learner would also shout out in pain when the voltage got too high. The experiment would have a preliminary and a regular run. The first was a practice of sorts, where the learner would get 3 correct answers and 7 incorrect ones, which would yield a shock up to 105 volts. The second, or regular run, the teacher would be told to read off a list of words and had to continue repeating it until the learner had gotten all of the pairs correct. The volt dial ranged from 15 to 450 volts, and to add further explanation for the teacher was labelled slight shock to danger severe shock. Above 300 volts, the learner would kick on the wall and then no longer give answers to the teacher's multiple choice questions. If the teacher showed any hesitation, the experimenter was able to give 1 of 4 prodding responses in sequence. The first was "please continue" or "please go on," followed by "the experiment requires that you to continue," and then "it is absolutely essential that you continue," and finally "you have no other choice, you must go on." The experimenter could only progress to the next prod if the teacher refused. If all 4 responses were reached, then the experiment would end. If not, it would continue all the way up to 450 volts. If the teacher asked any specific questions, the experimenter could reply. For example, will the shock leave any permanent damage? The experimenter could then reply with, although shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent damage. After the experiment, an interview would be undertaken, and the question, how painful do you think the last few shocks you administered were? The teachers were instructed to indicate their answer on a scale between 1 to 14, after which the teacher was reintroduced to the learner and the experiment was fully explained. The experiments began in July 1961 at Yale University, and 40 subjects would volunteer through this newspaper advert. And the results would surprise all predictions. The 40 men were from a cross-section in society from various different age and career groups, ranging from 20 to 50. During the experiment, most test subjects showed signs of severe distress when administering the electric shock. They were observed sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, and digging their fingernails into their own skin. The discomfort seen shown that the subjects were aware of the pain the learner was experiencing. Pre-experiment, it was expected that only a small amount of the subjects would administer the high voltage shock, between 1 and 3%, but this prediction would be way off. Of the 40 subjects, all reached 300 volts, at which the learner would bang on the wall and stop giving answers. Only 5 refused to go beyond this point. 4 more went on to shock the learner one more time and then also refuse. 2 stopped at the 330 volt level, and 1 each at 345, 360 and 375 volts respectively, meaning that only 14 refused the experimenter's prods. This meant that 26 proceeded all the way to the end, giving the highest available shock to the learner. Although most showed signs of discomfort and stress, they still obeyed the perceived authority of a guy in a white lab coat. The results were understandably unexpected, as from a young age we are taught to not hurt others, but with the addition of an authority figure, the teacher would abandon this fundamental part of their moral fabric. Scarily, there was no punishment for disobeying the experimenter, nor was there any reward for completing the experiment, as payment was assured from the start. Even more strange was the results were similar when a control study was undertaken with 43 unpaid students. In Milgram's paper into the study, he highlighted several particular conditions of the experiment that might have contributed to the high level of about 65% of compliance to the highest voltage level. The fact that the study was being undertaken at and sponsored by Yale possibly reassured subjects that the experiment was above board and reputable. The perceived randomness of the selection of learner and teacher also could have factored in, as a teacher may have thought that he could have been in the other chair, hence he was exposed to the same risks. The subject may have also have thought that as he had volunteered, that he was obligated to help the experimenter, and to the same extent that the learner had also submitted to the authority of the experiment. The subjects were also reassured that although painful, the shocks were not deadly, and that compliance was built through to shock level 20 when the learner would no longer reply. To refuse would cause a conflict situation where the wants of the learner and the experimenter were at odds with one another, and to side with the experimenter was the path of least resistance, so to speak. The short duration that the experiment ran for meant that the teacher had less time to think about the actions, resulting in little time for reflection. Milgram would repeat the experiment in several variations to see if any of the conditions changed would yield different results. Even when Milgram conducted the experiment in an unregistered office far away from Yale, the results were fairly similar. Now to the ethical question, was the experiment cruel? Well, in my opinion, no, but it can leave long-term distress to the teacher, especially if they administered the full shock. For many, the experience left self-reflection on how they had submitted to the authority of the experimenter. Ethical criticism came from the allowed discomfort of the test subjects, where even though they had provided their consent, the experiment should have been paused when the distress was observed. However, in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority, An Experimental View, pushed back on his detractors, saying that the ethical criticism provoked by his experiments was because his findings were disturbing and revealed unwelcome truths about human nature. It is really open to debate as whether the experiment was ethical or not, but regardless, it was a fascinating, dive into human nature.